I'm glad to introduce Dr. Destiny Peery, who is here to tell us about her career path for the APS SSCP How Did I Get Here video series. Dr. Peery earned a J.D. and a Ph.D. in social psychology from Northwestern University. She is currently an assistant professor at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. Her core research interests are at the intersection of identity, particularly race, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, and law and policy. Using experimental social psychological methods, she studies how people perceive and categorize others, as well as the downstream consequences of those perceptions and categorizations, particularly in terms of their contributions to experiences of prejudice and inequality. Further, she uses social psychological methods and theories to better understand how stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination play out in and interact with legal doctrines and theories. She teaches classes on race, social science and law, criminal law, and civil rights anti-discrimination law. Dr. Peery, please describe your career path and tell us about any obstacles or barriers that you overcame along the way. In addition, tell us what has surprised you about your job and what you wish you had known earlier about this type of position.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about, start with my undergraduate career, in part because psychology was my first love. So I came to college knowing that I wanted to study psychology. And I declared my major in psychology in my first year or in my first semester of college. And so the idea of getting a JD PhD and becoming a law professor psychologist was not something that was in my mind from the earliest days. And so psychology came first, and I really made it through most of my undergraduate career without ever thinking about going to law school. But as I started doing research with a faculty member in college who did work at the intersection of law and psychology, I also found a summer research fellowship that I did the summer between my junior and senior year of college, where I worked with a JD PhD social psychologist. And so I worked on a project about juries and decision-making and perception of various people on the jury. And this woman, Sherry Diamond, who is a law faculty member actually at Northwestern where I am now, encouraged me to think about adding the law degree to my psychology degree when I was thinking about going to grad school. So, law really came second, and it was a struggle for a long time to kind of figure out how to, for me, in a way that made sense for me, fit law and psychology together. So when it came time to apply to grad school, I had known since early on in college I was going to have to go to grad school. I wanted to be a social psychologist. You have to get a PhD, basically, if you want to stay kind of squarely in the field. And so I knew I was going to graduate school, but I had to decide, do I want to do the joint degree thing, and under what circumstances do I want to do that? And so I was looking for opportunities to go to a psychology department that I wanted to go to, where I could work mentors I wanted to work with on that side, but where I would also have the opportunity to do law school in a way that kind of wasn't too crazy or too burdensome for me as a student trying to navigate this interdisciplinary space. So in the end, I actually only applied to one law school, and that was Northwestern's law school. And I focused on applying to grad school in social psychology, and I had conversations with all of the departments I was applying to about the law degree and legal interests. And Northwestern was the only place at the time that had a joint degree program where I could do both degrees integrated together, where there was some kind of institutional support for fitting them together. So when I applied to law school. I took the LSAT, I did an application, took the GRE, I did grad school applications. And when I didn't know if I would get into law school, but when I did, I couldn't turn down that opportunity. So there are lots of ways in which this was suggested to me. I wasn't necessarily gung-ho about it, but I thought this is a good opportunity. If it works out, I'll take the opportunity, and it worked out. So in graduate school, I spent 2 years doing my master's and coursework in psychology and doing my qualifying exams. And then I spent 2 years in law school, just like a regular law student. And then I went back to my psych department and I wrote my dissertation. And then I had to decide when I came to the end of graduate school and law school about what type of job I wanted and what types of jobs to apply to coming out of grad school. And I, at the time, had not really enjoyed law school. I had loved graduate school. And so I thought a psychology department is the right place for me, even given my interdisciplinary interests and even given my law degree. So coming out of grad school, I applied to tenure-track psychology jobs. I applied to postdocs in psychology. And I kind of threw in at the end there a couple of fellowships in law school. So basically like postdocs in a law school. And so when it came down to it, I had a choice between a legal psychology job, a faculty job, a fellowship or a postdoc in a law school at Duke, a traditional social psych postdoc, and a law and society postdoc. So all completely different options with completely different consequences for potentially for my career in terms of what path that would set me on. I ended up taking the fellowship at Duke Law School. So I spent 2 years as a fellow, basically a postdoc, doing some teaching and with a focus on my writing and a focus on preparing to go on the law academic market when I came out of that 2-year fellowship. So I wanted to try out spending time in a law school, figuring out what it would be like to be a legal academic, because I didn't have as good a sense of that as I did what it meant to be in a psychology department as a faculty member. And so I was drawn to that, even though I didn't exactly know why I was drawn to it. And if you had asked me in advance if that was the choice I would have made, I would have said no. But I was drawn to it nonetheless, and that's what I chose. And I chose that knowing that there were some potential consequences for my career in terms of closing some doors, even if it opened others. So when I came out of my fellowship, I went back on the job market, and this time I went on the legal academic market, and I went on the psychology market. And in some ways, people say, how did you end up in a law school? And I say, well, law schools are who wanted to hire me. Psychology departments, it turned out, it was not a good market. It was not a good time to be on the market, but it was also, traditional psychology departments weren't that interested in someone with my profile who had just spent 2 years at a law school. And I did really well on the law school market. So I had a lot more opportunity to pursue that path. So if you had asked me at the start of that, even that second market, will you end up in a law school? I would have said, no way. I think I might have said even, I'm not sure that I want to end up in a law school. And I did. And I don't choice at all. It's a really good fit. And there's a way in which being in a space where so I actually am lucky to be at a law school where I'm the 5th psychologist, but that's very rare for a law school. And actually I feel more like a psychologist in my day-to-day life being amongst non-psychologists than I do being in a department full of psychologists, because it's just more salient that is something special that I bring to this environment that other people don't bring. So that's part of how I kind of got to where I am now, of being a law professor and also a social psychologist, and still doing research on the social psychology side, but writing law review pieces and teaching law classes, but also teaching law and psychology classes to law students. So I was not a kind of gung-ho about this path all the way. This is not a path I would have predicted in advance necessarily, but it's one that has worked out really well for me, and it is a great fit for me in ways that I couldn't have anticipated. So some obstacles along the way, that even saying that there were places where I hesitated and where I wasn't sure, it still sounds like a fairly linear path for me to end up where I am here. But there were other obstacles that were maybe not as easily seen by everybody around me, but that I experienced. One was, I'm a first-generation college student, let alone Ph.D. or J.D. or certainly the combination, the only J.D. or Ph.D. in my entire family on both sides. So I navigated a lot of this with the help of really great mentors, but I also had to kind of puzzle through a lot of this on my own, because I didn't a community of people in my family or outside of the small group of people in my programs who had any idea what I was doing. And then there's just the obstacles of being an interdisciplinary scholar. So being a student who's aspiring to that and then being one now. So there's kind of, you have to accept that you're making your own path, and that making your own path can be lonely and scary at times, and that you can have great mentors, but they may not understand exactly what it is that you're doing at all times. And you have to sometimes make decisions where you feel like you're making decisions where you don't have maybe as much information or support as people around you. So I had a Ph.D. cohort and I had a J.D. cohort, and they had tons of resources dedicated specifically to what they were doing in the paths that they were on. And I had to, in some ways, kind of cobble together advice and resources and make sense of that given my particular special path. And that it was a good challenge that I enjoyed. Obviously, I chose that path, but it was also made the path more difficult. And there's always the question in terms of this dual identity of, are you going to be enough for any one field? Are people going to feel like you belong? You know, where do you belong? Where do you feel like you fit? And, you know, coming out of grad school, I was having discussions with mentors who said, you know, if you don't take a social psych job or a social psych postdoc, you're closing the door on being in a psychology department. And I made that choice to go to Duke Law School knowing that that was a possibility. It became a reality when I went back on the market. So with that said, that, you know, introduces another obstacle, which is navigating a job market that's kind of tribal and disciplinary, where there are kind of clear demarcations between different disciplines. And if you're someone who's trying to translate or bridge or straddle those disciplines, that means that it's harder even than it is for someone who's very traditional to find a place where they fit. So all that said, there were lots of surprises for me in terms of the fit that I have actually experienced now that I'm in a position. And so despite my reluctance to be in a law school for various reasons, now that I'm here, I realize more than I could have ever realized before I got here, all of the ways that this is actually a great fit for somebody with my interest and background. For social psychologists in general. There should be more social psychologists in law schools or psychologists in law schools. And it's also sometimes surprising to realize like what fits. So we have ideas about what we think will fit. And it's not always true that it fits exactly when we actually try it on, that it fits exactly the way that we expected. And there are sometimes things that we're resistant to that we think there's no way that's going to fit, and yet we try it on for whatever reason, and we think, oh, this is actually better than I thought it would be. So I also was surprised by kind of going toward or being drawn to things that I wasn't expecting to be interested in. And that openness and willingness to pursue those intuitions meant that I landed in a really good position for myself that I wouldn't have anticipated being a good fit for me if you had asked me in advance. And again, I think it's a surprise to some people, and I've talked to other friends who have ended up in industry jobs or policy jobs or other non-traditional paths in terms of being outside of academic psychology, that have said that, you know, I feel more like a psychologist every day than I ever did as a grad student, surrounded by psychologists all the time. And I think that's surprising to realize that actually you don't at all lose your social psychologist or psychologist identity when you go out into a space that's not kind of full of psychologists. In terms of the things I wish I had known, I wish I had better understood or known how okay it is to be unsure about one's path. There's so many times, of course, as a graduate student and when you're on the job market and all of that, where things are uncertain, but we feel like we're not supposed to kind of feel that uncertainty in any kind of way, or we're just told kind of like, well, that's what everyone deals with, and, you know, just kind of deal with it, and there's not always a lot of conversation about that. But there's also, of course, uncertainty sometimes about what you want compared to the expectations that your advisors or other people have for you. And sometimes when, if they're saying, well, if you don't want what we're suggesting is your path, then what do you want? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, which was my experience, that there were lots of times I felt like I didn't know, and that I was doing things that I thought would move me forward, but I wasn't always sure why, not always completely kind of explicitly sure why I was doing that or what the outcome would be. And I wish I had actually kind of been prepped for the idea that walking a different path can be lonely and uncertain in ways that are different from your colleagues in one field or the other, who also will have uncertainties to deal with, but they will be of a different character. And so, when you're the only student in your whole department who's doing a joint degree, you have a fundamentally different experience than those students in some ways, certainly not in all ways. And there were times I watched all of my friends graduate without me, for example, and move on ahead of me. And I watched people have success on a market that I wanted to have success on, but because of my different profile, I didn't. And those were things that I didn't always have room to acknowledge with other people because I was the only one who had that experience. So I want to add one little piece, which is lessons that I've learned in my career path. And so these are things that maybe I don't wish I had known in advance, but because maybe I couldn't have known in advance, but there's certainly things that I've learned in the process. And that is to be open and to trust your gut. So certainly there are choices that I made that had I done what I had verbally expressed in terms of, or gone along with what I verbally expressed in terms of my preferences, I would not be where I am today. But there was something that was still open about me considering things that I had said I had foreclosed. For example, working in a law school, taking a law school fellowship, etc. But something was still open, and something in my gut said, do this thing even though you said you don't want to do this thing. Do this thing, it will be good for you in some way. It's a growth opportunity, whatever. So being open and trusting your gut is really important, especially with increasing uncertainty and a difficult job market. You don't know what opportunities are going to be out there. You may have an idea of what you think is the best one, but there are lots of other things that you may not know about, but that will fall into your lap for various reasons. That will be great opportunities that if you aren't open and you don't trust your gut draw to that thing because it's something you don't know about, that you'll miss the opportunity. Also, it's important to constantly reassess. Why are you doing what you're doing? What are you interested in? Has your idea about your path changed? Because it's easy to come into grad school in year one and think, I want to be an academic, I want to be in this type of department, I want to do this type of work, and then to think that there's no way to deviate from that path once you've decided that's your path. But if you allow yourself to reassess, you can check along the way. Do I still want to be an academic, or do I want to go into industry or policy, or maybe I want to shift my research completely in a different direction or something like that? So it's okay to reassess. It's good to reassess. I would summarize the next lesson as being do you, boo, meaning, it's your life. You have to make decisions for yourself, and your mentors and advisors all want the best things for you, but they also are living their own lives. They've made their own choices, and you can hear them and listen to them without always doing exactly what it is that they suggest, because for whatever reason, you understand your life is taking you in a different path than they think that you should. And if you have good advisors, they'll support you in that, even if you've gone against their advice. I describe my PhD advisors as being like my academic parents, and I thank them in my dissertation acknowledgments for being good parents in the sense of giving me advice and guidance, but also giving me the freedom to make my own decisions. Another lesson, some doors may close, but others will open. And people, especially young scholars, graduate students trying to get a job, we're always worried about closing doors because we don't think about the possibility that that will allow for certain other doors to open. And if you have training in psychology, there's so many things that you can do that aren't on the narrow path of academia, even though that is the kind of most coveted job. But there are lots of other great things that are out there, and we may have to close some doors in order to get the other right doors to open. And finally, there's no perfect fit. So going back to even thinking about being an interdisciplinary scholar and feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere and there were lots of questions about my fit, there's no perfect fit. I was under the illusion that a psych department would be the perfect fit and a law school would certainly be a completely imperfect fit. And the reality is they're both imperfect in ways that are different, but they ultimately have trade-offs in both directions. And so holding out for the perfect fit means that you're going to be holding out for something that doesn't exist. And again, it may lead you to miss really great opportunities that you weren't expecting because you're not able to appreciate all of the great things about this opportunity that is the one that's in front of you, as opposed to the ideal one that's sitting out there. So that's where I am now. I would love, to kind of reassess. I'm in my third year as an assistant professor, and I look forward to kind of constantly reassessing, being open and trusting my gut as I think about how to advance, move my career forward as I progress along the lines of being a faculty and toward tenure, et cetera.
Terrific. Dr. Peery, thank you so much for taking the time today to tell us about your very, very interesting path and give us so many useful tips. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.